Hello world of YouTube and welcome to List Week 2023, where I'm going to be breaking down my favorites and least favorites of things that I indulged in over the last 12 months within the realms of music, and in the case of today's video, gaming. Like last year, I capped off with my top 11 favorite games of 2022. I'm going to be capping off this list week with my top 13 favorite games I played in 2023. Now to those wondering why I'm doing a top 13 instead of a top 11, well, it's to sort of buck against a trend that I've seen rising throughout gaming over the last couple of years, but has gained full steam within the last handful of years in particular, in a way that isn't necessarily bad, because some things that fall within this trend do still end up on this list. But to go against that rising trend, I'm going to sort of add a couple more entries into this list. It'll make sense when I speak on it later, but for now, just know, top 13 favorite games I played in 2023. This was a great year in gaming in general, so to give more great games within a year of great games a sort of platform isn't necessarily a bad thing in my eyes. Either way, hopefully you're excited for it. Give it a like if you are, and let's go ahead and get started.
While it was a big contributor on why I was missing out on a few choice games I was excited to play, one thing I did this year was catch up on a few games that were seeing sequels drop in 2023. One such game was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. It was a game that definitely lived up to the hype I had for it when it was announced too, which was nice to see in hindsight. It's a fun Souls-like that I think introduced Cal Kestis and his pocket within the galaxy far, far away well. It also got me more excited to immediately tear through its follow-up Jedi Survivor. As a sequel, one thing I appreciate a lot is that it aims to build Cal's already beefy arsenal up in some excellent ways that made combat more fun to experiment with. While it stripped back on locations, they at least built the game around backtracking in a way that gave players a variety of goals they could reach that made the planets you explore feel a bit more dense, especially in the case of Kobo. Even if I wasn't into every cosmetic collectible side quest within Grease's Cantina, the ones I kept my eyes out for made exploring more interesting, and added to the expanded customizable flair the game was permeating with as a whole. The addition of things like animal mounting gives the world that other big oomph into something that feels bigger. I also think the story is a bit more compelling now that we're past Cal's origin story. It takes the subtitle of Survivor and really uses it to carry throughout its themes, that enriches the other pieces of Mantis' crew strongly, along with exploring Cal's inner struggles farther. It's also a story that I think presents an interesting question within the world of Star Wars, something I also admired as someone who you could say has waning interest in the greater ideas being explored within the universe by and large. The things that set it here are mostly due to some of the bugs. Admittedly, I don't normally knock a game for being buggy too much, and it was because of a bug that I even got one of the game's trophies. It's just something that, considering how stacked this year was in gaming, this was set lower due to those dings and chips in the AAA paint. If I were to retool my favorite Star Wars games list, something I've toyed with doing in the future, I could see this ending up in the upper echelon of that list, given what meat does lay within these bones. This year had a moment that some would say changed the industry forever. This guy is now officially voiced by two different people. Thanks, Charles Martinet, for further solidifying Mario's icon status with your characterization of him and the other leather hat plumbers. You've shaped many a childhood, and you will never be forgotten. While Chris Pratt's Hollywoodified Mario is not as bad as I thought I'd be, and I'd still say it's probably one of the weaker additions to the cast, I'm glad to say they've replaced him in the games with a good fit in Kevin Afghani, and the game that introduces his Mario is a pretty imaginative spin in Super Mario Wonder. The vision behind this bred some twists both on a level and control design approach, given the Wonder Flowers and different badges, create these fun blockbuster-like finales while giving players a bit more of an arsenal to customize Mario with. It also creates this community of sorts with the standees that give this more customizable experience. One of the things I loved about this design approach as well is that it gave a lot of these fun gimmicks that changed the spirit of Mario in a sort of way that made it feel more like a game that I love to bring up in conversation from the N64 era, Mischief Makers, where it's a world that has a handful of gimmicks strewn throughout the game. That's not a knock to it, because again, Mischief Makers is incredible, and things like the new power-ups help bridge that vibe with Mario in a new, fresh way. It's something I'm actually glad to see Nintendo do with this character. The new art style is super cute on top of that. If I were to give any knock to it that would set it lower on the list, it would be its difficulty. The game presents a way to play that is different than the normal Mario adventure, and it was fun to play it that way, but adversely, it also made for a breezy chunk of the game in its back half.
Still, I'd argue it's a success for the franchise, and I'd honestly like to replay this in a multiplayer context because I think it could just add to the madness in the best of ways.
Sometimes the gaming world gives you a real Coke-Pepsi dilemma. Two games in a field, but the vibes are just different. When it came between the two boat dudes, the game that were popping off this year, I ended up in the eerie fog-covered waters within Dredge's archipelago, but I loved the experiences I shared along its shores. The routines of ship maintenance and fulfilling side quests that risked you losing it all within the deep horrors throughout and the search for answers on your past was such a fun cycle. Some nights evoked some real tension within me as I slowly pulled into a dock with an engine blown so that I could sell some goods to get back on my feet. The level of progression also presents a great difficulty curve, and there's a noticeable difference in how your ship moves as you keep upgrading it. The changes within each type of fishing minigame was a fun idea too. The way each area within these islands gave you horrors big and small to stress you around each corner led to some nice sea horror concepts, along with having a nice bestiary of fish to collect if that's your bag. The controls are restrictive and sleek enough to give chases just the right amount of anxiety increasing that made my mistakes feel all the more grave. The mystery on each island, what bits of the world I learned through exploring made it worth a dive as well. The art adds to the darkness as well, with a portrayed personality to all the characters that envelop me more into this world. And it's an indie game well worth it, especially given that they've also got their own expansion that I can't wait to sink my teeth into. Console exclusivity felt more prevalent than ever in my opinion, with a handful of games across the board fighting for gamers' attention this year. While Nintendo has always had some bangers, and I did feel like I missed out on at least a few gems in the Microsoft camp, I also felt like as a PS5 owner, we got some choice ones from Sony. One that ended up a surprise pivot in some regards and acts as the reason for the December release this year, is the newest Final Fantasy. Now look, I'm no expert on the Final Fantasy series, there's still a handful of iconic games in the franchise I've not even touched. And I could see why some people that are especially longtime fans really don't like the direction that the action takes in this. I couldn't disagree more. I think its hack and slash style combat, along with its JRPG scale, only gets made better when combined together. It also helps that the main protagonist, Clive, is a strong one in my opinion. He really gives it to those that are trying to hold him back. I love that the story starts out as this personal revenge tale and evolves into a scale that I think uses the RPG length really strong and doesn't feel like it's stretching this sort of, what I wouldn't say is necessarily a shorter style of game into something that could feel bloated. I think it actually works really fucking well. I love that it sort of bridges out into other themes that I think other games also explored really well in the concepts, especially a game like Jedi Survivors. But it's got moments to it that build to stuff that feels very in line into the series. It's also kind of a little self-aware of itself and what it's trying to be in moments, which I think is also really fucking nice. Tangentially, it uses some of its recurring gameplay ideas well in the new gameplay style. That is to say, it's giving equal parts a DMC and a game like Kingdom Hearts especially, when it comes to things like moveset building and character tooling as a whole. While I wish the world exploration were more like it was in the last game, it does try to get Final Fantasy with it in a way that I can appreciate. Along with that, I do wish I felt more like I was in control of a party than I do, especially since I do love the people that join you on your journey. Having a game like this, with a soundtrack like this, along with bells and whistles like side quests that double as goofy tangents and serious world building moments that lean more into the RPG side of the series, made for a really fun excursion. They help reinforce Clive's plight and show this world at some of its harshest. It's still a game with character moments too. It's still an RPG-ass RPG style at the end of the day. It's just got a little more of a hack and slash flair that I think really stuck the landing. The trend I mentioned up at the top that was the reason for the top 13 this year was the overabundance of remakes that dropped throughout 2023. Hell, there are some that I had a lot of interest in that I still ended up skipping because of time investing in stuff throughout a calendar year, but I do plan on catching later on down the line. I've never been one to shame the remake cycle either, but I also acknowledge that we've been on this steady increase in the number of remakes within a year and wanted to give something new, or at least a continuation of something original, more chances to have spots in the proverbial 11 best games of the year. With that in mind, when I got my PS5, the first game I got was my own version of what I'm guessing some From Software fans felt when they bought the Demon's Souls remake, first above all else, by playing the Dead Space remake before anything else the console had to offer. While it wasn't as different as a certain remake that also dropped this year, what switch-ups they did throw into the story and the tweaks they made to certain aspects of the controls and gameplay do make what I'd say is one of the best games of its era a bit better and push it into the modern day splendorously. That's also coming from a graphical perspective too, because this game is gorgeous. It also further proves the point that I brought up in last year's best of list that I needed this upgrade. Thank you, Rachel. Outside of that, it's the same tense and gory excursion I love so very much. It was a blast re-exploring the USG Ishimura once again. Simple as that. Isaac, you've never looked better, man. This year, I did something I never thought I'd do. I completed my North American F-Zero collection. Even if I still need Climax to finish the whole set, that didn't stop Nintendo from making my North American collection incomplete for the short part of an afternoon by announcing and immediately dropping a new entry in their Battle Royale pilgrimage via F-Zero 99, a game that throughout its rollout of the maps was fun to pop back into. The layout is simple but effective at keeping me rolling in for one more race. The revolving door of events made even better with each rollout. The strategy for each map also felt more dynamic amidst the chaos, capping off with the classic mode on top of that being a fun full circle moment for giving the authentic F-Zero experience online. If this is Nintendo's way of prodding interest in the series, I hope they gauge initial hype as a barometer, because I know I'd seen a lot of good reception to the idea of a new F-Zero game. Considering how great this was and how good a game like Metroid Dread was, I think Nintendo could pull together another cool F-Zero game with a collective mind. If you decided to skip on this, I'd definitely give it a spin if you like racing games. It's got a bit of a curve, but given the massive crowds have thinned out and they have a mode like that classic mode, it creates an experience that I think could be a good easing into the ideas of F-Zero as a series to newcomers. Plus, it's free, which is also good, because a lot of the series is free on the Switch and is becoming playable on the Switch, so Nintendo have their ducks in a row to tee up for a good relaunch, and I'm hoping they take use of it. Similarly to a different game you could all guess will end up on here, Spider-Man 2 had some huge shoes to fill. Spider-Man 2017 is one of my favorite games of that year, along with one of my favorite superhero games in recent memory. Even if I hadn't taken the time to play the DLC like I'd planned, because I'd gotten a PS5, I also got Miles Morales prior to playing this, and caught up with the world so that I'd be ready when it dropped, which was a pretty fun, if not a relatively too brief experience that reminded me of some of the side games the Far Cry series drops from time to time. Similarly to my initial playthrough of the first one, I sought out to platinum the game within the time I had it, because ironically enough, I didn't buy this game either, like what had happened when I originally played the first. The game feels engineered to make that experience possible within its structure, though. It does more with less in the grand scheme, while using its assets to flesh out each character pretty well. It also has some great twists on the characters used that I think feels more fresh than the directions they've taken the characters in recent adaptations. It acts as a great middle piece on the process, too, by showing growth within its world with some choice threads dangling in the horizons. Even if some of its other additions didn't wow me as much as I'd hoped, and I'd admittedly would have swapped out some costumes for others in the Spider-Man history catalog, my biggest critique comes in the combat. While I like how they made the combat style in Miles Morales feel fully realized in this, and it made a good fit for both Spider-Man within the story with those expansions, I found myself enjoying the combat from the first one a bit more. I'll admit it's a deeper combat system, and I had a good rhythm for the combat down. I just like the flow of the first better as far as like ability to switch up gadgets, and maybe it's just because I didn't learn the combos quite like I should have. That critique aside, I'd still say this surpasses either iteration of these characters before when it comes to developing and exploring both Peter and Miles, but extends where both of their games left off. I really like where the game fleshes out the world and how it evolves throughout it. How the New York itself having to overcome a colossal scale disaster like its opening creates a neat backdrop that I enjoyed. The changes they made to non-Spider-Man levels I thought was a decent switch up too, and I enjoy the other little pivots the concept of two-character combat brings to the table. I love where we end up on the other side of the adventure. Even if I had little to no use for the post-game, I'm excited to see where they take this world in DLC, given what seeds they planted within the game's nooks and crannies.
I kept a personal promise to myself this year by sinking my teeth further into non-Nintendo RPGs again, following my diving into Triangle Strategy last year. I started Shining Force, which I hadn't played in ages, but put it down around the start of the summer when more games were dropping, along with starting my first ever playthrough of Fallout 4, but dropped after scooping one of the most revered games of the year that I'll also be talking about later on in the list. Following a friend's recommendation, I picked up Sea of Stars and loved it so much I picked up a copy of Chrono Trigger with hopes of streaming it this year, considering I'd heard it called a clear point of inspiration for it, along with being one of the most revered games of all time that I still haven't played yet, but that's beside the point.
I've never played Chrono Trigger.
I've never played Chrono Trigger!
How
have neither of us ever played Chrono Trigger? Should we just put it on E to piss people off?
Yeah! I loved following Valerie and Zale as their adventure goes farther and farther into a story that kept me guessing throughout its emotionally gripping and mind-blowing story that kept throwing curveballs at me well into its third act. I absolutely adored the party as it evolved around them too, because this game has a lot of panache with its writing that gave it some charm. Many of the characters had a well-written personality that made the caravan more fun as a whole. There's some sidesteps and quests along the road that are both simple and deep respectably that motivate the player to comb through the world in a way that was giving Golden Sun, along with a little bit of Super Mario RPG. However, the combat system in this game is the most unique and fun wrench in the turn-based formula that takes it to another realm. It adds a little more chaos to the battle that I think is great. Plus, this game's music is choice as fuck. If you're looking for a fun indie RPG with a world that unfolds to some huge scales, Sea of Stars really flies amongst its namesake. To learn it's also within a world of a different indie game from a few years ago that I had interest in after its release, that gives me even more intrigue into it, and that feels like icing on the top of it all. The fighting game rivalry of the 90s was alive once again in 2023. NetherRealm and Capcom both pitting their flagship fighting franchises against one another. This time, personally, I think Street Fighter 6 came out on top in spite of my childhood love of Mortal Kombat fueling my hype for its second reboot. Admittedly, I didn't sink my teeth into MK1 as much as SF6, but within the time I spent with MK1, I can say I was relatively disappointed in a handful of ways. It's not from a gameplay stance, because the game does play very well, and mechanically, it's another strong fighter. It's just got some backstory issues that I've seen Ed Boon talk about online, and when experienced were disappointing to see, along with other issues I'll talk about in a video later this month as a turbo nerd of this series. All of those and more, I think, further cements Street Fighter 6 as the victor in this round in my eyes. I may have mostly been on my Ken grind.
My man loves his Kens.
I love me.
But what dips I've done into other nooks and crannies of this game yielded a lot of meat upon these well-articulated bones. Maybe it's because I also played its demo before it dropped and I loved the character creation mode, but I was sold on this conquest-ass, Final Fight-ass story mode where you have to use styles of and woo your masters to get more for them from the start. The fact that I can just pick fights with random NPCs and literally fight in the street, come on, man. The actual fighting itself is so much fun too. Capcom is further solidifying this renaissance with a great engine that I think helps elevate this old heads game into something new that I can really appreciate, and I feel like I've grown from. Plus, this game is so goddamn gorgeous. There's a charm to this that got me more interested than the still entertaining, if not relatively messier, story mode from MK1. Look, I made a whole last video in October breaking down how this remake exceeded any already pretty low expectations. It is that good and gives the same level of change on a decent scale while retaining and expanding upon the spirit of the original. The full package is definitely worth it, more so than I'd even argue the 2 remake was, and I fucking love that version. Like I said though, Capcom is just cooking with gas right now, and even if they weren't as prolific as years past, they kept the banger train rolling between Street Fighter 6 and this. Tears of the Kingdom is my number 3 game of the year. Following up a game as great as Breath of the Wild is a heavy task. When it comes to the time spent with a game this year, Tears of the Kingdom is the one that easily reaches that crown, at least on my Switch. Hell, even in spite of that, I didn't even do everything the game had to offer, because just like that game, there's a large wealth of things to do in this iteration of Hyrule. The 3-ish maps created this elevation to exploration that I never would have dreamed achievable, and lives up by and large to a lot of my expectations I had for a follow-up to what I named my game of the decade. With that said, similarly to what a game like Resident Evil Village did to bridge the world of Resi 7 to the rest of the Resident Evil franchise by and large, Tears of the Kingdom makes a new spin on the more narrative-focused Zelda that brings some of the weird hurdles seen within some of the more revered titles in the series within this world that just aren't there in Breath of the Wild. One big critique I'd co-sign is I think the opening of Tears of the Kingdom is doing something very neat, but is ultimately made lesser by a tutorial that just isn't as good as what I will say is one of the best openings to any Zelda game. While some of those new plot-driven elements got me more enticed to do side quests that were also in Breath of the Wild, more so than in that, I also did them out of order, which spoiled some of said plot for me. I also think that the final boss in this game is better than in that game. This game has a similarly hurdled crossing to that point. The pacing of the game when the narrative is the focus slows the game down to a crawl that just isn't seen in the more world-focused, less narrative-driven Breath of the Wild. For as much as I love the game's strengths, just like every other Zelda game I love, it's got its shortcomings. Also, Please patch a post-game or something, Nintendo. I want to explore this world, without the threat of Hyrule's downfall looming behind me. Spider-Man 2 at least had a post-game, even if I only needed it for essentially 3 trophies by the time I beat the main story. It's still a hell of a game. Do I think it's better than Breath of the Wild? Probably not. But in some regards, I think that it is. Maybe someday, I'll sit down and break down the minutia of my favorite Zelda games in order, but until then, just know, Tears of the Kingdom still rips, still worth your time if you're a Zelda fan. It's just not the best game that came out in 2023. In spite of my scattershot track record with it in practice, and have basically vowed to never start a campaign unless it's a perfect storm of right people at the right time, I still love D&D on paper. That intrigue of it in that context is why I bought Baldur's Gate to begin with, earlier than I'd originally planned, in fact. And given how December ended up, I'm even happier I did. Even if I'm only on the cusp of Act 2 of its campaign, I'm now doing so with 2 separate characters. I'm also already trying to plan out a third. I love being at the mercy of dice in a way that I am in D&D, but to an nth degree that streamlines some of the minutia of tabletop RPGs that still doesn't lose its charm in the process. Dice rolls mid-combo, and while exploring always spark intrigue of what the other outcome would have ended up. Hell, before I even bought it, I knew it'd be Game of the Year. It's a game where I've literally never heard anyone I've talked to about it that sank time into it have nothing bad to say about it. I'd be pressed to agree, too. The fact that I'm doing shit my friends never did is insane. The fact that Shake and I spent an hour together doing shit I hadn't done in like the 10 hours I played by myself prior. The characters you have in your party have an interesting dynamic. It's a game that, oddly enough, like Breath of the Wild, is one where you get what you put into it. I beat a quest by shoving the people I was supposed to fight off of a bridge, for fuck's sake. However, unlike Tears of the Kingdom, it feels exponentially deeper. It puts the G in RPG, but uses the role to direct play in an insanely well-constructed way. I was supposed to overthrow these goblins with the help of these ogres, and I just fucking left them mid-battle. If they ever find me, they're gonna be pissed because I was supposed to pay them, and I don't blame them. This game is wonderful, and I know if I'd given this the Elden Ring treatment, I might have actually gotten farther with it. It scratches that itch left by games like KOTOR. We'll see if I bring it into my rotation on the internet somewhere if I ever get my life together, but as it stands, it's easily a game that I could see being foundational and shaping the direction some RPGs take in the future. It is a game that is so nuanced and deep that it is absolutely worth your time. During the Game Awards this year, I was shocked to see the Sega leaks were true, and we be getting a remake of one of my favorite games of all time. The thing is, I wasn't that into what little bits they teased. Don't get me wrong, I'm curiously intrigued. I'll still probably be there day one like I was with the Resi 4 remake. But unlike the not as excited of a reaction I had to that remake, it wasn't because I thought Jet Set Radio wasn't in need of a remake. It's because I already just can't get enough of. In spite of it being maybe one of the shortest games I played this year that I really loved, Bomber Cyberpunk not only met the already immense hype I had for it, given what it was a spiritual successor to, but like the games like the Bloodstained series does to reinvent aspects of its roots, this does so with Jet Set wonderfully. The ways it expands upon concepts from Jet Set Radio, both in gameplay and from a narrative standpoint, are incredible. Where it sets itself apart from the inspiration is where I think this game shines even brighter too. Its graffiti system is genius, and what separates each vehicle from each other gives the game a realm of experimentation and playstyle that I really appreciate. I like the character focus in the narrative, and I think it presented some great set pieces in the process, along with some incredible twists to keep the pacing fresh. I love the gameplay loop this narrative presented. Graphically, this game is gorgeous as well. I played it on the Switch, but have seen it in ultra-wide on PC, and it's pure art. I talked about the soundtrack earlier this year, but it's still well integrated into my rotation. It's just a great collection of songs, some of which inspire me in the same way that Jet Set has, and I think that's special. While this year provided a bevy of things within the hierarchy of niches and personal special interests within gaming, Bomber Cyberpunk just shined above all. Plus, it's probably the most time I've ever sank into a post-game because the challenge was that satisfying to pull off. Given all the free press I've given to this game throughout the year, you could have probably predicted that this was going to be on top. As for the Jet Set Radio remake, it sounds like it'll be an interesting spin on the foundations from the original, and I can share some extended thoughts in my 2024 hype video, but comparing what they've shown to Bomber Cyberpunk, I'm just more into what this has going on. You know, come to think of it, between Roller Drum last year and Bomber Cyberpunk this year, that further begs the question, what stylized rollerblading dystopia could await us in the return of Tokyo Toe?
That was my list. What did you think about it? Did you like it? Did you not? What was your proverbial game of the year that you played last year? Let me know that and some of your thoughts on this video in the comments down below. If you did like it, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. Either way, I'm gonna go. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.